Hello everyone and welcome to the lecture on AWS Web Application Firewall WAF. So this lecture will contain all these topics. What is AWS Web Application Firewall? How AWS WAF works? AWS WAF components, AWS Web ACL capacity units, AWS Web Access Control List, AWS WAF rule and rule group actions in Web ACLs, the Web ACL default action in AWS WAF, AWS WAF rule groups, relationship between Web ACL, rule groups and rules. So what is AWS Web Application Firewall? AWS WAF is a web application firewall that monitors the HTTPS request forwarded to your protected web application resources, ensuring their security. AWS WAF can protect various resource types such as Amazon CloudFront distributions, Amazon API Gateway REST APIs, application load balancers, AWS AppSync GraphQL APIs, Amazon Cognito user pools, AWS App Runner services, and AWS verified access instances. With AWS WAF, you can control access to your content based on criteria you specify, like the IP addresses that request originate from or the values of query strings. This allows for granular control over who can access your resources. Based on the specified criteria, the service associated with your protected resource responds to request either with the requested content, an HTTP 403 status code forbidden, or a custom response, ensuring appropriate access control. AWS WAF can also protect applications hosted in Amazon Elastic Container Service ECS containers. To enable this, you can configure Amazon ECS to use an application load balancer with AWS WAF, which routes and protects HTTPS layer 7 traffic across the tasks in your service. So how AWS WAF works? To use AWS WAF, you start by defining a Web Access Control List ACL that specifies the rules and actions for handling incoming HTTPS requests. Once you have defined the Web ACL, you associate it with one or more web application resources that you want to protect, such as Amazon CloudFront distributions or application load balancers. The associated resources forward incoming request to AWS WAF for inspection by the Web ACL. AWS WAF examines the request based on the rules defined in the ACL. In your Web ACL, you create rules that define specific traffic patterns to look for in the incoming request. These rules help identify potentially malicious or unwanted traffic. Specify actions for matching request. For each rule, you specify the action to take when a request matches the defined traffic pattern. The available actions include allow the request to proceed to the protected resource for processing and response, block the request and prevent it from reaching the protected resource, count the number of requests that match the rule without taking any additional action, run CAPTCHA or challenge checks. Present a CAPTCHA or challenge to the user to verify that they are a human using a standard browser, helping to prevent automated attacks. AWS WAF components. The following are the central components of AWS WAF. Web ACLs. You use Web Access Control List to protect a set of AWS resources. You create a Web ACL and define its protection strategy by adding rules. Rules define criteria for inspecting web requests and they specify the action to take on requests that match their criteria. You also set a default action for the Web ACL that indicates whether to block or allow through any request that the rules have not already blocked or allowed. Next is rules. Each rule contains a statement that defines the inspection criteria and an action to take if a web request meets the criteria. When a web request meets the criteria, that's a match. You can configure rules to block matching requests, allow them through, count them, or run bot controls against them that use CAPTCHA puzzles or silent client browser challenges. Next element is rule groups. You can define rules directly inside a Web ACL or in a reusable web rule groups. AWS Managed Rules and AWS Marketplace sellers provide managed rule groups for you to use. You can also define your own rule groups. AWS WAF Web ACL Capacity Units WCUs. AWS WAF uses Web ACL Capacity Units WCU to calculate and control the operating resources that are required to run your rule groups, and web ACLs. AWS WAF enforces WCU limits when you configure your rule groups and web ACLs. WCUs do not affect how AWS WAF inspects web traffic. AWS WAF manages capacity for rule groups, and web ACLs. First is rule WCUs. So AWS WAF calculates rule capacity when you create or update a rule. AWS WAF calculates capacity differently for each rule type to reflect each rule's relative cost. Simple rules that cost little to run use fewer WCUs than more complex rules that use more processing power. Rule group WCUs. The WCU requirement for a rule group are determined by the rules that you define inside the rule group. The maximum capacity for a rule group is 5000 WCUs. Each rule group has an immutable capacity setting which the owner assigns at creation. This is true for managed rule groups and rule groups that you create through AWS WAF. When you modify a rule group, your changes must keep the rule group's WCUs within its capacity. This ensures that web ACLs that are using the rule group remain within their capacity requirements. And lastly, web ACL WCUs. The WCU requirements for a web ACL are determined by the rules and the rule groups that you use inside the web ACL. The cost of using a rule group in a web ACL is the rule group's capacity setting. The cost of using a rule is the rule's calculated WCUs minus any processing optimization that AWS WAF is able to obtain from the web ACL's combination of rules. For example, if you define two rules to examine the same web request component and the rules each apply a particular transformation to the component before inspecting it, AWS WAF might be able to charge you just once for applying the transformation. The basic price for a web ACL includes up to 1500 WCUs. Using more than 1500 WCUs incur additional fees according to a tiered pricing model. Okay, next is AWS WAF Web Access Control List, Web ACLs. So this is one of the core component. AWS WAF Web ACLs allows you to control access to your web applications by defining criteria to allow or block requests. These criteria include IP address origin, filter request based on the originating IP address, country of origin, allow or block requests from specific countries, string/regex match, look for a specific string or patterns in parts of the request path size, filter based on the size of particular parts of the request, then malicious SQL or scripting detection, identify and block requests containing malicious SQL code or scripting. You can test for any combination of these conditions using logical operators, providing flexibility in defining your access control rules. In addition to the specified conditions, you can block or count web requests that exceed a certain number of requests per minute, helping to protect against high volume attacks. AWS WAF allows you to run CAPTCHA puzzles and silent client session challenges against requests to verify human users and standard browser behavior. You specify your matching criteria and the corresponding actions in AWS WAF rule statements, which can be defined directly to your web ACL or in a reusable rule groups that you reference in your web ACL. If you add multiple rules to a web ACL, AWS WAF evaluates them in the order they are listed, allowing you to control the priority of rule application. When creating a web ACL, you specify the types of resources that you want to use it with. After defining the web ACL, you associate it with your resources to start protecting them based on the defined rules and criteria. Next is AWS WAF rule and rule group actions in web ACLs. So allow and block actions are terminating actions in AWS WAF. So when a rule within an allow or block action matches a web request, it stops all further processing of the web ACL on that request. The matching rules action determines the final disposition of the request for the web ACL. AWS WAF does not process any further rules in the web ACL that come after the matching one, whether the rules are directly added to the web ACL or inside an added role group. or inside an added rule group. With the block action, the protected resource does not receive or process the web request at all. Count is a non-terminating action in AWS WAF. So when a rule with a count action matches a request, AWS WAF counts the request and then continues processing the rules that follow in the web ACL rule set. The count action allows you to track the number of matching requests without stopping the processing of subsequent rules. Captcha and challenge actions can be either terminating or non-terminating depending on the token status of the matching request. When a rule with one of these actions match a request, AWS WAF checks the request token status. If the request has a valid token, AWS WAF treats the match similar to a count match and continues processing the rules that follow in the web ACL rule set. However, if the request does not have a valid token, AWS WAF terminates the evaluation and sends the client a captcha puzzle or silent background client session challenges to solve before proceeding further. If the rule evaluation process does not result in any terminating action, which is either allow, block, captcha or challenge without a valid token, then AWS WAF apply the web ACL's default action to the request. The default action is the action that AWS WAF takes on requests that do not match any of the rules in the web ACL. So let's see what is web ACL default action in WAF. So when you create and configure a web ACL in WAF, you must set the web ACL default action. This action is crucial in determining how WAF handles web requests that pass through all the rule evaluation without triggering a terminating action. WAF applies the default action to any web request that makes it through all of the web ACL's rule evaluation without having a terminating action. A terminating action such as allow or block stops the web ACL evaluation of the request and either allows it to continue to your protected application or blocks it. The web ACL default action must determine the final disposition of the web request, meaning it must decide whether to allow or block the request. Therefore, the default action is always a terminating action. If you want to allow most users to access your website, but you want to block access to attackers whose requests originate from specific or specified IP addresses or contain malicious content, choose allow for the default action. Then when you add rules to your web ACLs, add rules that identify and block the specific request you want to block. With the allow action, you can also insert custom headers into the request before forwarding it to the protected resource. If you want to prevent most users from accessing your website, but you want to allow access to users whose requests originate from specified IP addresses or contain specified values, choose block for the default action. And then when you add rules to your web ACL, add rules that identify and allow the specific request you want to allow. By default, for the block action, the AWS resource responds with HTTP 403 forbidden status code, but you can customize the response if needed. So fifth is just the opposite of fourth one. Next we'll see what are AWS WAF rule groups. So a rule group is a reusable set of rules that you can add to a web ACL. So it's part of web ACL, and rule groups fall into the following main categories. So first is your own rule groups which you create and maintain. Next is managed rule groups that AWS managed rule teams create and maintain for you. Then you have managed rule groups that AWS marketplace sellers create and maintain for you. And then fourth is rule groups that are owned and managed by other services like AWS Firewall Manager and AWS Shield Advanced. Okay, let's see what are the differences between rule groups and web ACLs. So we'll see the aspect and the difference between rule groups and web ACLs. So containment. So rule groups cannot contain rule group reference statements, but web ACLs can contain rule group reference statements. Reusability. Rule groups can be reused in multiple web ACLs by adding a rule group reference statement to each web ACL. So this cannot be used. Default actions. So rule groups do not have any default actions, but web ACLs have to have default actions for each rule or rule group included. Association with AWS resources. So rule groups are not directly associated with AWS resources, but web ACLs are directly associated with AWS resources. Capacity, fixed WCU setting that must be set at creation. System defined maximum capacity of 5000 web ACL capacity units. Then there is one similarity though, which is rule groups and web ACLs both contain rules which are defined in the same manner in both the places. So this is the one similarity. Okay, this is the last final slide. So we have talked about, just to summarize, so at the highest level we have something called as web ACL, and web ACL contain either rule groups or rules. So it can have either rule groups or rules, but rule groups contain rules. So it always contain rules, set of rules. And what we have seen is rule groups are 4 types: managed rule groups, your own custom rule groups, AWS Marketplace Sellers rule groups, and AWS Firewall Manager and AWS Shield Advanced rule groups. So these are the 4 types of rule groups, and rule groups again contain rules. And finally, rules is the lowest unit, and our single rule contains a rule name, a rule statement, which is an inspection criteria, and then you have rule action, which are basically allow, block, count, capture and challenge. And based on the action, it can finally result in a result which can be non-terminating. So non-terminating means it will just go through for valid unexpired token, and result can also be terminating with blocked request for invalid or expired token. So if it is terminating, it will be the request will be terminated or blocked. But you can have you can process it based on you can have a count or something, or you can have you can also provide with captcha or a challenge, silent challenge to the browser. And this whole thing is a part of, as I mentioned or talked about, is part of web ACL or rule groups. So web ACL also have a default action, and this does not have a default action. Let's say if it does not match any of the criteria in the rule groups or rules, web ACL can have a default action whether to allow or block. So let's say you have configured rule, but it does not match any criteria, then you can take a default action which is at the web ACL level. So this whole system is designed to provide the maximum flexibility. So you can either create rules in web ACL, so it can be multiple rules, not just one rule. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you can have multiple rule groups in web ACL, and you can have maximum possible flexibility. You can either reference from some other person rule groups. You can create your own rules. You can have the logical operators to basically, or you can do a count. So let's say count is above 5, then only deny it if it is. So you can have all kind of different permutation and combination to basically process the incoming web request. And that's all. Thanks for watching.